Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Olivier Sibony. He's Associate Professor at HEC Paris. And today we're going to focus on his new book, together with Daniel Kahneman and Cass Sunstein, Noise, a Flaw in Human Judgment. So, Dr. Sibony, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you, Ricardo. It's a pleasure to be here.
Okay, great. So, first of all, let's talk a little bit about human judgment. So, what is it exactly?
So there are lots of definitions of judgment. The one we've used in the book that we just published, Noise, is that judgment is wherever you think there is a correct answer, but it's not obvious what it is. So let's take a few examples. If I ask you, how much is 2 plus 2? Well, that's not a matter of judgment. We know, or we should know, how much is 2 plus 2. If I ask you, do you prefer ice cream or chocolate, or do you prefer Bach or Beethoven? That's not really a matter of judgment. That's aesthetic judgment, but we're allowed to disagree. Now, in between those two things, there is the big realm of domains where we expect agreement, but we do not expect perfect agreement. That's judgment. So if I ask you what is going to be inflation next year, that's a prediction. It's in fact a type of judgment. We call it a predictive judgment. If you say 3% and I say 2%, it's a reasonable disagreement. Reasonable people are allowed to disagree. Judgments is basically the domain of things where we expect some degree of disagreement between reasonable people, but not too much.
But is judgment a single cognitive mechanism, or is it composed by several cognitive mechanisms?
There are different types of judgments. I just gave you the example of a predictive judgment. So if we ask who is going to win the next football game, or who is going to win the election, or what is the temperature going to be tomorrow, there is going to be a correct answer, and we're going to find out. That's a prediction. It's a type of judgment. Now, there are also types of judgments we've called evaluative judgments, where it's not just about making a prediction, it's about making trade-offs between different values. So if you ask, how should we deal with the COVID-19 epidemic in a particular country? That's a trade-off between what's going to happen if you take action A and what's going to happen if you take action B, and what are the benefits and the costs of various options in terms of lives, in terms of the economic impacts, in terms of individual freedoms. That's a very complicated set of trade-offs. And again, that's something where people who make those decisions assume that there is a best answer, but they realize, if they're not completely crazy, that reasonable people can disagree about what the best answer is. So it fits the definition of judgment. And if we want to be a little bit more specific here, to make those evaluative judgments, to make any evaluative judgment that is a trade-off between different dimensions, you're also going to need predictive judgments that support them. To take again the example of the pandemic, to make a decision that yes, we should lock down, or no, we should not lock down, I need some sort of estimate of what is going to happen in terms of how many people are going to get sick and how many people are going to die if I do and if I don't lock down. So there is always a set of predictive judgments informing the evaluative judgments. That's the difference between the two. The difference is actually not that large because, again, the defining feature of those judgments is everybody assumes that there is a correct answer and that reasonable people should come close to it.
Right. So does judgment connect in any way with the literature on biases and heuristics?
Oh, absolutely. So the literature on judgment and decision making, which has studied heuristics and biases for a long time, and especially since Danny and Amos Tversky started working on this in the early 1970s. This literature has focused on systematic errors of judgment. Systematic meaning directional, meaning that the error goes in the same direction. Classic examples of biases, which of course you're familiar with, would be things like the planning fallacy. So if 10 of us have to make a forecast of how long it's going to take for us to complete a particular project, say, having our kitchen redecorated, we're going to tend to be optimistic. We're going to tend to underestimate the time that it's going to take to do that. That's a directional error. It's a predictable error. It's a systematic error. That's bias. What has been a lot less studied is the fact that if we make these 10 estimates, we're not going to have exactly the same forecast of how long it takes to redecorate the kitchen. There's going to be variability around the mean. Yes, the mean error is going to have a direction that we can predict. That's the bias. But there is also going to be a dispersion of that. So basically what we're saying when we're talking about noise is we focused on the mean error, the bias. Why don't we also look at the standard deviation of those errors, the noise, because it's also a big component of the error.
Mm-hmm. But are biases always errors, or are they simply part of normal human cognition and sometimes they produce errors and other times not?
So the whole heuristics and biases movement started, and I'm quoting from memory here, but in 1974 in their classic paper, Kahneman and Tversky wrote, these heuristics generally produce answers that are fine. It's not their exact words, but you can look it up in the, I think it's the second paragraph of the article. Generally it's fine, but sometimes they create systematic errors. Now, so that has been distorted and mistaken and misinterpreted as saying that people always get things wrong. That is not what they wrote, that is not what they meant, and that is not what they've been saying since. What they've been saying since is what you just said, which is that most of the time the heuristics that we use allow us to solve complex problems just fine. Sometimes they lead to severe and systematic errors called biases.
Mm-hmm. Right. And do we know specifically, now talking specifically about noise, do we know what are the causes behind it?
So it's a difficult question to answer because unlike biases, noise does not have a very identified cause. The whole principle of noise is that it's a statistical phenomenon. It's not a causal phenomenon. It's something you observe. You observe that there is a dispersion in our answers. Let's take again my very simplistic example of 10 people making a forecast. If there is an average error, that calls for an explanation, right? And the explanation in my simplistic example is going to be that, hey, we tend to have an optimistic bias. Maybe we somehow want this to be completed sooner. Maybe we underestimate we don't imagine the many ways in which things can go wrong, and we instead imagine the central scenario in which everything goes right. I mean, there are many accounts of why the planning fallacy happens, but we can actually find a causal account to explain the shared error. If we now focus on your estimate and my estimate and the third person's estimate and the fourth person estimates, and they're all over the map. Yes, their average is optimistic, but each of the individual estimates is over the map. It's very hard to come up with a reason, with a cause, for why each of these individual estimates is different from the others. And in fact, the whole idea of noise is that it's not about the cause of each individual judgment, it's about the variability of the causes that cause them to be different. So noise is inherently statistical, not causal. It's inherently something that does not have a cause, which is why it is so difficult to see and so hard to think about, and one of the reasons why we believe it hasn't been discussed much until now.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, we can't evaluate noise at the individual level. It's always at the collective level.
Absolutely. Noise is, again, a statistical phenomenon, which means that it's only when we look at a number of judgments that we're going to be able to see noise. Noise is the standard deviation in judgments. Now, if we look at an individual judgment, we can ask ourselves if there is noise in it by thinking counterfactually. So let me take two examples to contrast that. If we have, let's take the pandemic example again. If we have 10 countries facing roughly the same situation, or let's say exactly the same situation to make things simple, and they respond in 10 different ways. right? That is noise. We've got noise in an important judgment here where different people who presumably are trying, by and large, to pursue the same goals are coming up with different responses. Or you could take, again, my example of a forecast where 10 people are giving a different forecast. That is noise. Now, suppose that we only look at one of those countries. Suppose that this is not a pandemic, but this is an epidemic striking one country, like SARS 15 years ago, or some new epidemic striking a particular country. Is there noise in the response to this particular epidemic? Or if you see one person making a forecast, is there noise in that forecast? We can't know because we're looking at one only. But the fundamental drivers of noise, the things that make our judgment unstable, which we're going to talk about, are there. And you can think counterfactually, if I had made that forecast when I was in a different mood, or if the person in charge of preparing the response to the epidemic had been a different person with a different background, would the response have been different? And the answer is probably yes. So there is an invisible and impossible to measure amount of noise in those singular decisions, as we call them, which of course makes it even harder to see. But there is noise even in individual decisions for those reasons.
So you mentioned singular decisions there. Are there differences between singular and recurrent decisions?
In practice, there are. So again, take the example of responding to one epidemic or looking at 100 countries responding to the same pandemic. That's the difference between making a singular decision where no one can compare your decision to somebody else making the same decision at the same time, and a recurrent decision or a multiple decision where a lot of people are making the same decision or you are making it yourself a lot of times. That is not an absolutely clear-cut, ironclad distinction because there are shades of gray between the two, but we sense that this is a different kind of thing. If you are a company launching 100 products a year, that's a recurrent decision. If you are making one major acquisition that is going to transform the company, that's a singular decision. And a lot of what we know about noise is based on the study of recurrent decisions because we can measure noise there. But we believe that what we learn about noise in recurrent decisions applies to singular decisions as well, where the noise is not visible but is implicitly there if you think counterfactually.
Mm-hmm. And what is occasion noise specifically?
So now we're moving to the different types of noise,
Sure.
and we break it down in three big categories. The first one that you mentioned is occasion noise. Occasion noise is the fact that if the same person makes the same decision on different occasions, the answer is not going to be exactly the same. One striking example of this comes from the study of fingerprints, where a scholar called Etiel Dror in UCL in London has been studying this for a long time. And he's, among other studies, he has submitted the same pairs of prints, so a latent print and an exemplar print. That means the latent print that has been collected at a crime scene and the clean print that has been taken from a suspect, where a fingerprinting expert has got to say, do these match? Are these basically the latent prints of the suspect on the murder weapon? So he's taken pairs of prints like this, which a particular expert had seen some weeks or some months earlier, and he's shown them to those experts again. And you would, of course, expect the answer to be the same. If it was a match 6 months ago, it should be a match today when looked at by the same experts. And by and large, of course, that's the case, but not perfectly. There is sometimes some instability in the judgments of those experts. That's an example of occasion noise. And when you start looking, you find that judgments that should be stable are in fact not as stable as you think they are. There is some inconstancy, some instability in judgment. One other striking example of that comes from econometric studies that measure the influence of factors that should not influence decisions on those decisions. For instance, does the temperature affect judicial decisions? Yes, it does. Does the result of this weekend's football game affect the decisions of the court on Monday morning? Yes, they seem to do. These things should not happen because we wouldn't want those factors to have an influence on those decisions, but apparently they have a small influence. That's occasion noise. So occasion noise is basically the instability of the judgment of the same person on the same case.
Mm-hmm. But I mean, these factors like mood, fatigue, weather, and others, can we call them causes of noise?
We can call them causes of the causal factors that impact the individual decisions of the individuals making those decisions. So yes, if they vary, they are going to be causes of noise. The weather is not a cause of noise if the weather is the same for you and for me. The variations in the weather are going to be a cause or if the weather is the same when I make both of my decisions. If I make one decision during a snowstorm and an otherwise identical decision on a sunny day and my decision is not the same, we could say that that's a cause of my decision. Now, why do I take all these precautions in answering your question? Why don't I just tell you, yes, of course, Ricardo, the answer is yes, it's a cause of noise. Because when we think about it that way, we lose sight of what actually makes noise important and interesting, which is that, yes, the weather causes occasion noise, but so does my mood, and so does my fatigue, and so does the sequence of the other cases that I've looked at before the one I'm looking at now. And so does the reaction I have to a lot of otherwise irrelevant aspects of the case that I'm looking at. So if I'm a judge, to take again that example, we will never be able to say what are the causes of that judge's particular judgment when trying the case of Olivier, who has been convicted of whatever. There are going to be so many different factors creating variability in that judgment that in fact, for practical purposes, we can only call it noise, and we cannot try to explain it with purely causal factors. When we try to explain it with purely causal factors, when we put the spotlight on a particular cause, we may be able to find a shared cause, i.e. a bias. So if you say, the reason the judge has sentenced Olivier to a lenient punishment is because the judge is a racist and punishes blacks more severely than whites. That may well be the case. That may well be true. That would be a bias. But that does not fully account for all the decisions of the judge, who is influenced by a myriad other factors that are causes of noise.
Mm-hmm. So we talked about occasion noise. What are the other kinds of noise?
Two more kinds. One that immediately comes to mind and that most people think about when we talk about noise is the fact that some people are more, some people aim higher and other people aim lower. Take the example of judges again. Some judges are tough, hanging judges. And you can ask any lawyer in a courthouse and they will say, oh my God, you got this judge. That's bad luck. He's a tough guy. Oh, you got this one. You're lucky. He's a bleeding heart judge. With a bit of luck, you'll get away with a slap on the wrist. So that's what we call level noise. Some judges, I'm taking here the example of judicial judges, but it would be the same for professors. My students know that I'm sure they have an opinion of, am I a tough grader or lenient grader, and is Professor Ricardo a tough grader or lenient grader? If you are doing evaluations in a company and there are raters and ratees, some raters rate higher and other raters rate lower. So some people have a different level in their judgment, on average, across all cases. We call this level noise. This one is the one that immediately comes to mind. It's actually fairly easy to control. So if I'm a tough grader, you can have a rule, and in fact, my school has a rule that I'm not allowed to give an A to all my students. I need to limit the number of A's to a certain fraction of the group, and there needs to be a certain number of B's and a certain number of C's, and there is some flexibility around those numbers, but basically we control for level noise in that way. So that's the second type of noise. There is occasion noise, there is level noise. And then there is the third type, which is the really interesting one, and which is really less obvious than the other two. Occasion noise, we sort of can wrap our minds around fairly easily. Level noise is very easy to understand. The third type is what we call pattern noise, stable pattern noise. What is that? Take the example of the judge again, because it's the easiest one to figure. Say Judge Ricardo is a tough judge on average, and Judge Olivier is a lenient judge on average, right? So on average, across all the cases that we look at, Ricardo will mete out tougher sentences than Olivier. Ricardo, did I say, yeah, Ricardo is tough and Olivier is lenient, right? Now, suppose that we both look at the same person. Through some experiment, we've created a situation where we both look at the same case. Does that mean that you will always be tougher with this guy and I will always be more lenient with this guy? Well, no. Because maybe in this particular case, there is something that means something to you and doesn't mean something to me, or vice versa. Maybe I'm lenient in general, but this is a white-collar criminal, and on average, I'm really stringent with white-collar criminals because I believe that should not be tolerated and we should be tougher on those. Or maybe you're on average very tough, but you tend to be especially indulgent when the delinquent is a juvenile or someone young who has had a difficult family background, and you make an exception for those kinds of people. Now, I'm making it sound like it's a rule, like these are principles, like we can identify the reasons, but maybe it isn't even that. Maybe the particular defendant that we're both looking at reminds you of someone you know who is a good friend and who had a difficult life, and you feel for him, and despite being generally severe, you're going to be lenient with this particular guy. And I am usually lenient, but I really don't like this guy, and what he evokes in me is actually quite negative, and that's going to change our priorities. In other words, the pattern of judgments that we're going to have when we look at a number of different cases is not going to be the same. Our averages are what they are, that's the level noise, but our ranking of the cases is not identical. And that's what we call the pattern noise. What's fascinating about the pattern noise is that it's where we express our personality. It's where we express our individuality. It's really where we express judgment. If you're a judge and I show you 10 cases and I ask you which is the most severe one and which is the least severe one, and you do the same with me, and we have a different ranking, we will feel strongly about that. We will feel that we've expressed what we believe is our obligation to judge and our responsibility to judge and to have priorities. We will have expressed something like our personality. And that personality, that judgment personality, that individual variation in how we respond to particular specific cases is actually a source of noise, because it means that identically situated individuals are going to be differently treated by two different judges.
Mm-hmm. I understand. Could you now explain the concept of noise audit?
So when I was saying, suppose that we can show you the same defendant, show you and me the same defendant and ask us what we think, that would be a noise audit. That would be an experiment in which we somehow make it possible for different people to be looking at the same cases. The first looked at this was an insurance company. Maybe not everybody's favorite idea of an exciting example, but actually, bear with me. Let's try to make it exciting. Insurance companies have lots of people making judgments, making quantitative judgments, which makes it easy to study. So take an insurance company where you have underwriters. They are the people who put a price on a particular risk. And normally, if Mary, Jane, and Peter are three underwriters in the same company, and an inquiry comes in from a company that wants a quote on how to insure a big factory against the risk of fire, and Mary happens to be available, well, Mary is going to be looking at that inquiry, and she's going to prepare a quote, and she's going to tell the company, it should be the premium you'll have to pay is going to be $100,000 to insure this risk. Now, on another day, it might have been Jane or Peter, right? But it just happened to be Mary who is available. Normally, we would never find out what Jane or Peter would quote if that particular customer had landed on their desk. In a noise audit, you actually create a situation where you artificially give the same inquiries to Mary, to Jane, and to Peter, and you measure the difference. Now, when this was done in the insurance company, we measured the results, and what happens there is that, of course, people expect some variability. They realize that it's a matter of judgment, and as we said earlier, a matter of judgment is one where we expect some reasonable amount of disagreement between reasonable people. But how much is reasonable? Ask the people in the insurance company, ask people in any other company, really, and there is a popular answer. They're going to say 10%. If on average the difference between two people looking at the same case is 10%, that's something tolerable. That's something that the organization can live with. That's something where we wouldn't need to take action to reduce it. But when you actually do the noise audit, when you measure how much difference there is between these underwriters, it's roughly 5 times larger than that. It's about 55%. On average, the difference between two quotes is 55% of their average. That's a lot, and that's a lot more than they are prepared to tolerate. And basically everywhere where we've been able to do or to study the results of a noise audit, it turns out that the difference between is a lot larger than people think. It doesn't mean it's always 55%, but when people think it's going to be 10, it's 55. When people think it's going to be 0, like in fingerprints, it's not 0. And that basically is what we summarize in one of our mottos in the book, which is that wherever there is judgment, there is noise, and probably more of it than you think.
Right. And how does noise apply in the context of predictive judgment?
Noise applies in all judgments. It's easier to measure in predictive, well, it's easy to measure in any judgment. It also applies in predictive judgments. Take 100 analysts who are, or 100 is a lot, but take 10 analysts who are trying to forecast what the price of a stock is going to be next week. They have 10 different points of view. Now, that is variability. Is it noise? Is it an undesirable aspect of their judgment? Not necessarily in this particular example, because some of them are going to buy and others are going to sell, and a week or a month or a year from now, the price of that stock is going to go up or down, and we're going to know who is right and who is wrong. So these particular disagreements make markets. They are not a problem in and of themselves. If, on the other hand, you have two doctors who are making a predictive judgment and who are saying, for instance, this tumor is benign or this tumor is malignant, right? One of these doctors, at least, is wrong. The tumor is either benign or malignant. This is a predictive judgment in the sense that they're making a prediction that what they're looking at is or isn't a malignant tumor. That disagreement is noise, and it's deeply problematic for the obvious reasons in this example.
Right. And could you explain the difference between clinical and mechanical predictions?
So this goes back a long time to work that started in the 1950s with the work of Paul Meehl, among others, but especially with Paul Meehl. And Paul Meehl was studying the judgment of clinicians in psychology, and then by extension the judgment of lots of other people making clinical judgments, meaning basically that they look at a case, they look typically at a person, and they make an overall holistic judgment about that person. It could be a psychologist proposing a diagnosis about that person's mental illness or health. It could be a university admissions officer saying, we should take this person in and we should not take that person in because that person has better potential than the other. It could be a hiring decision, who is going to be the better candidate for a particular position. All those decisions are judgments in which essentially you have a number of inputs, you have a number of data points, and you have to synthesize those data points into a decision. So if you're making a hiring decision, you've got maybe a couple of interviews and a test result and a resume, and you make a decision based on that. What the research on clinical versus mechanical, or sometimes called statistical judgment, has been saying for a long time is basically if this aggregation of inputs is done mechanically, if you have a rule to decide how are you going to aggregate those inputs, you're not going to do worse, and you're often going to do better than the holistic judgment of a clinician. The mechanical aggregation of those inputs is often going to do better than the clinical judgment of a particular expert. That doesn't mean that you're replacing, it's important to stress that, it doesn't mean that you're replacing, for instance, a diagnostician in medicine with a machine. You still need someone to identify the inputs. You need someone to decide if the clinical signs are there. It doesn't mean in recruiting that you have a machine deciding whom to hire and whom not to, because you still need someone to do an interview and to collect information about the candidate. What it does mean is that when the time comes to say, we've got an interview score of 3 out of 5, we've got a test score of 5 out of 5, and we've got a resume score of 1 out of 5, what decision do we make based on that? That decision is generally going to be better if it's made by a formula than if it's made by an individual. That is very surprising, and even more surprising is the fact that it has been known for a long time and has had very little impact because people simply don't believe it. People simply, clinicians simply don't accept the idea that a simple formula can do better than them. Now, in recent years, the debate about artificial intelligence has cast a new light on this issue because it's not a simple formula anymore. It's a very complicated formula or a very complicated technology that actually promises to do even better than the simple formula, and in many cases, much better than the clinician. That changes the discussion quite a bit.
Mm-hmm. Can studying noise help us better understand certain social phenomena, like for example, how and why groups polarize?
So the polarization of groups is an example of noise. Mm-hmm. When you take two groups that start in the same place, we observe, and we've all seen in our experiences of working in groups, that they can end up in very different places depending on seemingly marginal or unimportant factors that typically occur at the beginning of the discussion. And a group that starts, for instance, with a positive view of the issue at hand might end up with a very positive view, and another one that starts with a mildly negative view could end up with a strongly negative view. That's what is often called group polarization, as you described it. That actually is an example of noise in the sense that a small and theoretically unimportant factor at the beginning of the discussion might actually be amplified by the group and result in much larger variation than you would normally see between groups. So it's a manifestation of noise.
Mm-hmm. Right. And can we say that crowds are wise?
So how would you make a group or a crowd wise? Take again this example of group polarization. The typical way people would handle a discussion like that would be, if we are, for instance, a group of people deciding to hire someone, we would start with the first person saying, yeah, she looks like a great candidate. I'm really excited. And then the group is going to end up in a place where everybody is really excited about that candidate. And we're all very confident and very bullish and saying, yes, let's make her a very high offer to make sure that she accepts it. Meanwhile, another group next door could have started with the first person to speak saying, yeah, she's not such a great candidate, and would end up with exactly the opposing view with equal confidence that she is in fact not a great candidate. How would you avoid that outcome? There's actually a simple way. Before you start that discussion, make sure that each of the people who has information about the candidate gives independent input to the decision. Independent being the key word here. Make sure that people express their independent view before they are influenced by the views of the others. Then, that's where the wisdom of crowds comes in. Take the average of those views, and that will give you a better estimate than you would have after a group discussion. At least that's the wisdom of crowds assumption. Generally, that's going to be true because noise being random error, it's going to cancel out when you take the average of independent views. What is not going to cancel out is the shared error, i.e. the bias. So if you're, again, in the recruiting decision, if the 10 people who are around the table share a bias about certain candidates, which is a distinct possibility, that bias is not going to be eliminated by averaging. By the way, it also wouldn't be eliminated by group discussion. On the other hand, the biases that group discussion tends to amplify and the noise that group discussion tends to create will not be there if you have a procedure that takes an average of the discussion of the group before the discussion, which is why it's actually better. Why don't companies do that? Why don't organizations do that? Because they value consensus. They want to agree. They want to actually come to that point where everybody nods their head in unison and says, oh, aren't we in agreement that this candidate is great? Aren't we all very comfortable agreeing with one another? It's uncomfortable to look at the results of a group where people who all think they are reasonable people are in disagreement. And we need to get more comfortable with that disagreement if we're going to be making better decisions.
Mm-hmm. Can we say that deliberation is a good strategy to reduce noise?
No, in fact, deliberation is a strategy that increases noise, as in the example that I was just giving. What would reduce noise, the form of deliberation that would reduce noise, and which some organizations use, is a combination of averaging and deliberation that is sometimes called mini Delphi or estimate talk estimate. Take the example of the hiring decision again. Suppose that before we start the discussion, all the people who are around the table give their view on the candidate on a score of, say, 1 to 5. And then we show everybody what the average is and what the dispersion of the answers is. And now we deliberate. Now we talk. And that's when, Ricardo, you tell me, well, I actually gave this candidate a very low score because of this particular element. And now I'm hearing you and I'm thinking, okay, well, I was really bullish, but that really changes my mind. I didn't cover that aspect of the candidate's background. And if she really told Ricardo this, now that's a deal breaker. Now I'm going to align with Ricardo. And that form of deliberation, and now we can have a second round of estimation, of voting, essentially, where we're going to find some more convergence because now it has been informed by the deliberation. What is the difference between this and the traditional deliberation that you would have in most groups? It is that if we started the discussion with me speaking very confidently about why this candidate is great, and then a second person saying very confidently why the candidate is great, and then a third person saying, yes, I agree, the candidate is great, and you are the fourth one to speak, maybe this particular piece of information that in fact had the potential to sway me, to change my mind, you would have kept it for yourself. You wouldn't have wanted to dissent from the opinion of 3 people who had already spoken, or 4 or 5, because, again, disagreement is uncomfortable. And making sure that the deliberation is informed by the independent judgments that are formulated before the deliberation is going to limit that risk. So deliberation can be great if it follows independent judgments, if it precedes the expression of independent judgments, and it precludes the expression of truly independent judgments, it's not so great.
Mm-hmm. How much noise is good noise, so to speak?
There's two ways to answer that. The first way is about the definition of noise. There are disagreements that are good, that are not noise. If we are engaged in a creative endeavor or in a research project, and you and I take different routes and have different views of how we're going to solve the puzzle, that diversity of views is actually a great success factor. It's actually going to make it more likely that one of us succeeds. If we are competing in a market and some of us are going to win and others are going to lose, the fact that we have different views and different solutions to propose to the market is not a bug, it's a feature. It's great. So that's a problem of definition. We define noise as the unwanted variability in judgments where we expect that there is a correct answer. When we don't expect that there is a correct answer and we don't object to variability, it's not noise. So that particular variability, which we don't call noise, is good. I'm just clarifying this because often people say, well, but some noise is good. Isn't it good when people disagree on the solution to a technological puzzle? Yes, it is. We just don't call it noise. Then there is a different issue, which is that not all noise is worth fixing. If my grading of my students is noisy, which it is, I can tell you it is noisy, and unfortunately, my judgment is not perfectly stable. I am not superhuman, and there are days when I'm in a good mood and days when I'm in a bad mood, and there are students who are lucky because the 3 essays that I read before them were terrible, and their okay essay looks great in comparison, and there are students who are unlucky because the 2 I've just read were great, and their okay essay looks poor by comparison. So, I'm noisy in my grading. What are the solutions to that? Well, the solution for my school to this noise in grading problem would be to say, let's have 2 or 3 or 5 graders grade each essay. And then it becomes a cost-benefit analysis. What is the cost of the noise in the grades I give to my students? Well, it's certainly unpleasant for the guy who gets a worse grade than he should have gotten. It's actually quite pleasant for the one who gets a better grade than deserved. But does it make a huge difference in the end? Probably not, because I'm only giving them 1 grade. Those grades are average, and the transcript that they're going to get at the end of the year is going to have a grade point average. That is the average of a lot of grades. So one particular grade doesn't make a big difference. Yes, we wish it was noiseless, and that would be better and more just. But does it make a big difference? Is it worth fixing? Probably not. So this very simplistic example points to an important idea, which is that there is a minimum amount of, there is some noise everywhere. The optimal amount of noise is not 0 because the cost of bringing noise down to 0 or close to 0 would be unbearable for a lot of things that are actually not worth it. Where we should focus our noise reduction efforts are on those decisions that are truly consequential. One example that we write about at length in the book is the example of criminal justice. One judge's decision, once you have been sentenced, once you have been found guilty by a jury in the US, a judge is going to decide on your punishment. Do you go to jail for 3 years or 5 years or 7 years or 9 years or 11 years? And the judge has a lot of leeway in how much punishment to give a particular defendant. One study, one noise audit, as we would now call it, found some years ago that the mean difference between 2 judges looking at the same case, on a case where on average the punishment would be 7 years in prison, the mean difference was 3.8 years. So just by being assigned to judge A or judge B, that would be a 3.8-year difference in your punishment for a sentence that on average has a punishment of 7 years. That's a very, very large difference, and it's very hard not to find this shocking. Somehow we've learned to live with that, and we've learned to consider this a fact of life, something that we have to live with because it's human judgment and there's variability in it. I think we should get a little bit more outraged about this. I think we should ask ourselves, what do we do about this? If you heard that there is such a difference because of a bias, because of a difference between genders or between ethnicities or between backgrounds, you would find it absolutely unacceptable, and you would be right. It would be absolutely unacceptable. When it's because of the randomness of being assigned to one judge or another, or to one judge in a good mood versus the same judge in a bad mood, we just say, fact of life. I think we need to do something about that.
Mm-hmm. And should we trust the experts?
That's another manifestation of noise that we found that is quite interesting. When we rely on experts to make judgments, we sometimes rely on them to make predictive judgments that can be evaluated after the fact, and sometimes we rely on them to make judgments that are not predictive and that cannot be evaluated. To take the obvious example, if you are a weather forecaster and you predict that it's going to rain 100 times and it rains 97 times, you're probably a pretty good weather forecaster and we can call you an expert. Now, if you're a political forecaster and you go on TV shows and you confidently explain what is going to happen in the current political crisis unfolding in Chad, and you spell out your understanding of the role of the different factions that are at work there, and in the end you say, and therefore my prediction is that the current regime is going to win over the rebels and is going to be stabilized with the support of France and other countries and whatever. You've made a prediction here that in this case is testable. And when we look at the research that has tested the validity of those predictions, it's actually not very impressive. On average, this is the work of Phil Tetlock and Barb Mellers and Don Moore and some of their colleagues of the Good Judgment Project. On average, those political and economic forecasters forecasting very complex events do not do a very good job. They are not quite as good as chance, or barely better than chance, to make a long story short. Some of them, though, are good. Some of them, when you actually measure their forecasts on specific predictions, some of them are what Tetlock calls super forecasters. And one of the really intriguing things that Phil Tetlock and some other researchers did in recent years was to look at what makes those super forecasters better than the others. Why are they so much better? Not perfect, of course. The future is difficult to predict. But why are they so much better than other forecasters? One of the key drivers of their performance is that they are less noisy. They are more stable in their judgments. They are less prone to overreacting to new information, but they're also not locked in their previous views. They do react, but they do not overreact. In other words, they are less noisy in their judgments. And through a really complicated but really interesting statistical technique, one of Tetlock's colleagues used, a researcher called Viles Satopa, they were able to show that if you break down the quality of forecasting between the information that people bring to bear, the bias that they have or that they don't have, and the noise that they have or that they don't have, the big explanatory factor in what makes people better when they improve or what makes them good when they are better is that they have less noise. So there's, to make a long story short here, the fascinating message here is if you are really an expert, worthy of the name expert, not what we call a respect expert, which is an expert that lives only of the respect of their peers. If you are truly an expert, it's probably because you are better able to resist noise than your peers.
Mhm. But when there's noise, how can we be sure who got closer to the right judgment?
Sometimes we can, and sometimes we can't. So some judgments are predictive judgments that are verifiable, that can be verified. If you and I and 20 other people make a forecast about next year's GDP growth, at the end of next year, we will know who is right and who is wrong. And if we measure your performance and my performance and the performance of those 10 other people for 15 quarters, we can in the end say some of these people are actually better at forecasting GDP than others. Olivier is wrong every time by a big margin. Ricardo is pretty close most of the time. And if we score the accuracy of their forecasts, Ricardo is a lot better than Olivier. So that's a forecast where we can know who was right and who was wrong. Unfortunately, when it comes to what we call judgments, there are lots of judgments where we will never know who was right and who was wrong. Take again the example of COVID. Country X makes a decision to deal with it in a particular way. Was it right or was it wrong? Well, we all have views, and many of us have very strong views. But we will never know what would have happened in this particular country at that particular time if something different had been done. There is never a clean comparative experiment where we can run the world in separate ways to get a clear answer. So that's a judgment that we call a non-verifiable judgment. And lots of judgments are in fact not verifiable, and yet we expect that there is a correct answer. Here's what's really interesting about noise in those kinds of judgments. When a judgment is not verifiable, for instance, let's take a judgment that is predictive but not verifiable. If I say climate change is going to lead temperatures on average on the planet to increase by 2 degrees between now and 2080. Well, that judgment will be verifiable in 2080, but neither you nor I will be there to find out. So for practical purposes, this judgment is not verifiable. Or suppose that we say, if we go to war, we will be crushed and we will lose. And therefore, we're not going to war. That's a prediction. But we hope it won't be verified because we hope we won't go to war and be crushed. It's because we assume that if we go to war, we'll be crushed, that we will decide not to go to war and therefore to do something different. We won't know if you're right or if you're wrong when you make a judgment like that. We won't know if you were right to say, if we go to war, we will be crushed. But we can measure the amount of noise in the judgments of different people making that judgment. We don't need to know what the correct answer is to measure noise. If we look at your forecast and my forecast of the temperature change between now and 2080, we won't know if your forecast is right or my forecast is right, but we can know that they're not the same. We know there is noise. And we know that when there is noise, there is a problem. We don't need to know who is right to know that one of us at least is wrong. And we want to understand why, and we want to do something about that.
Mm-hmm. Are there any good scientifically validated ways of improving our own judgment?
There are lots of ways, we think, to improve our judgment and specifically to reduce noise in our judgment. The challenge here is that, as we've pointed out now, there isn't a specific cause of error that we're trying to fight when we're fighting noise. When we're fighting bias, when we say, for instance, oh, we are victims of the planning fallacy, so we tend to be too optimistic, we know that we can improve our judgments by having some cushion, having a margin of error that is going to, or having a margin of safety that says, you know, if you think you're going to finish building this plant in 12 months, well, you know, let's not plan to start serving customer after 18 months because history has taught us that people tend to be too optimistic in their forecasts. So that's a bias. We can improve the quality of our judgment by debiasing, by fighting the bias. for instance, in this example, by knowing that there is a planning fallacy. We can also improve our judgment in many situations where we know there is going to be a bias by nudging people in the right direction. You know the topic of nudges, of course, and you're familiar with the term. When we suspect that the context in which people make a decision is going to push them in a particular direction which is undesirable, we can change that context, we can change the environment in which the choice is made in order to nudge them in the right direction. The classic example that Cass Sunstein and Dick Thaler take in Nudge, the eponymous book, is if you're in a cafeteria and you put the fries before the greens, people are going to eat more fries, and if you put the greens before the fries, people are going to eat more greens. You're not forbidding them to eat fries, but if you put the greens first, you're going to gently nudge them to have more greens. So that's another way you can improve people's judgments. You can nudge them in the right direction. Now let's come to noise. What can you do about noise? Again, the problem with noise is it's not causal. It doesn't have a particular reason, and you don't know in what direction the error is going to be. How can you fight this invisible enemy? How can you prevent noise from making your judgments go wrong when you don't know what sort of noise and in what direction it's going to make your judgments go wrong? This is tricky, but there is a way. We call it decision hygiene. And the reason we call it decision hygiene is, the reason we use this metaphor is because it's a bit like washing your hands. When you wash your hands, you're not thinking, here goes the flu germ, and here goes the COVID germ, and here goes the cholera germ, and and here goes the you see my drift. You don't know what enemy you're fighting. You just know it's good prevention. And decision hygiene works the same way. It's a set of tools and techniques you can put in place in your decision-making process to make it more resistant, more robust to the factors that would make your judgment go wrong, to the factors that would create noise, without knowing and without needing to know what those factors actually are and in what ways they would make your decision go wrong. You can take precautions that will reduce the noise in your judgment, and it will improve the quality of your judgment without knowing exactly how much and in what way. Take again the example of my recruiting committee that I was talking about before. If you say good decision hygiene demands that before we start deliberating, we individually write down our summary of what we think of the candidate on each of the dimensions on which we're evaluating the candidate, you're practicing good decision hygiene. Now, you won't know if without that hygiene, the committee would have erred on the side of, yes, let's hire the candidate, we're all very confident, or no, let's not hire the candidate, we're all very confident that this is not the right candidate. You won't know what mistake you've prevented, but you do know that you reduce the chances of one mistake like this being made. That's one example. There are many more.
Mm-hmm. So one last question. Would these solutions apply across different domains of human judgment, or would we have to tailor them for each specific domain?
We think the set of tools that we call decision hygiene, the set of remedies that we call decision hygiene, apply pretty much universally to situations of judgment, but it's a toolbox. It's a repertoire of different techniques, and not all of them are going to be needed everywhere, and not every one of them is going to be equally applicable. So what we've done in noise is we have a number of different examples, and we've got chapters about different domains. We've got a chapter about medicine, we've got a chapter about forensic science, we've got a chapter about hiring decisions, we've got a chapter about performance evaluations, we've got a chapter, we've got lots of different examples, and we show how in each of these different domains, a different strategy for noise reduction seems to be one of the dominant ones. For instance, in medicine, the strategy that works very nicely is guidelines. To have guidelines that say, we we all have a clinical judgment, but guidelines help us to be more consistent from one doctor to the next and from one moment to the next. That seems to work wonders in some domains of medicine. Not in all, by the way. It works very nicely for diagnosing newborns who are suffering from respiratory distress or something like this. It doesn't work very nicely for psychiatry. There are some domains where it works better than others, but that's one noise reduction strategy, one decision hygiene strategy, guidelines. Another one, which I was describing in my hiring example, is the aggregation of multiple judgments, the averaging of multiple independent inputs. That works in some domains, like forecasting, for instance, but it doesn't work very practically in other domains because it's either impractical or not very effective. So in each particular domain, you will have to pick the strategies that you think are both practical and efficient and that are not too costly. And we think that we are giving you the beginning. It's an early field. We're not pretending that we have solved this problem definitively. We just want to draw attention to it, really. But we're giving you a toolbox if you are making decisions from which we think you can at least pick and customize some tools that will improve your decision making.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's end on that note. Again, the book is Noise, a Flaw in Human Judgment. Would you like to mention the places where people can find you on the internet?
Sure. So I've got a website, which is my first name and last name, oliviersibony.com. And I also am on LinkedIn, where I'm easy to find.
Okay, great. So I'll be leaving links to that in the description box of the interview. And Dr. Sibony, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show.
Thanks a lot, Ricardo. It was a pleasure.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for watching this interview until the end. So it is thanks to people like you that the show has been running for such a long time, more than 3 years now. And I would like to ask you to please pay a visit to my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge there. If you prefer PayPal, you can also find links to it in the description box of the interview. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share the interview, leave a like, hit the subscription button, and comment on it. This show is brought to you by Enlights, Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters, Karen Litska, Anne Blanchett, Pererga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunder, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Castle, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whiting, Bernardo Wolf, Tim Hollis, Henrik Alenius, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Bosch, Bo Weingart, Becker Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetrio, Robert Windegar, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Zoop, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Thomas Trumbull, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Colombo, Jorge Pinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Michael Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Yugni, Alexander Dunbauer, Omari Hickson, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Ala Herzog, Don Ross, Jonathan Librand, Oslam Bullet, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Eden Solan, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londonio Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Miran B, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostazewski, Max Bailby, Nelek Bach, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Al Ortiz, Guy Madison, Gary G. Ellman, my producers, Izar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Ian Gilligan, Sergio Codriano, Luís Caetano, Tom Vanegdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardas France, and Niruban Balachandran, and my executive producers, Michelle Rugieski, Rosie, James Pratt, and Matthew Lavender. Thank you for all.